kind of discovered her at random. I was playing a piece that was in a collection of music by Black women composers, and it had bios of the other composers in the book. And so there was a short 2-paragraph biography of her. And it talked about, her being a child prodigy and how she died in the Vietnam War helping evacuate children. And so I had to read more, so I ordered her biography and started trying to track down some of her music to play. And that's when I discovered it was a much longer project than I expected, because at that point I didn't know that her music wasn't published. So some very patient librarians helped me track down the actual manuscripts and guided me through the process of getting copyright permission, ordering scans, and all of that. Philippa was a child prodigy. She grew up in Harlem in the 1930s. She was the daughter of a black writer in the Harlem Renaissance and the white daughter of a Texas cattle family, at a time when it was illegal in a lot of states for her parents to even be married. So she encountered a lot of obstacles over the years pursuing a career. But as a child, she was famous as Harlem's Mozart for both her performing and her compositions she wrote. She started writing music as early as age 4, and by the time she was 10, she had written almost 50 works. As an adult, she traveled the world. She started her first international tour when she was 19, playing for the Haitian president's inauguration, and from there, she traveled almost continuously. By the time she died when she was 35, she had performed in about 80 countries all around the world, everywhere from Iceland to all across the continent of Africa, Europe, Beirut, China, Taiwan, everywhere you could think of. And along the way, she also became a freelance journalist. She wrote about war crimes and civil war in the Congo and reported on the Vietnam War as well. She wrote multiple books about those experiences. She traveled to Vietnam in 1966, at first to perform for the Saigon Conservatory, but she quickly became really interested in what was going on in the war. And she was able to disguise herself as Vietnamese, and she spoke French and Vietnamese, and she would stay at convents around the countryside. And because of that, she was able to get into areas that most American journalists were not. And so the American intelligence community really wanted her to go home during that, but she also got involved in helping to evacuate women and children and clergy from hot zones to safer areas. By her count, she evacuated over 70 people. And it was on one of those flights that she died when the helicopter crashed yards from shore. The only fatalities were one serviceman, Schuyler, and the child sitting in her lap. So some of her works were very easy to find and very clear to read, especially her earlier works, like what she had written when she was a child and some of her early folk music arrangements. But the later pieces, especially the ones she wrote when she had started that freelance journalism career and was traveling all over the world for that, were a little more difficult to put together. They were a little messier, and they weren't necessarily in the location they were supposed to be in the archive. So ultimately what I ended up needing to do was go in person and look through about 50 boxes worth of music, letters, all sorts of papers of hers, programs, everything you could think of, just to try to find things that were missing, make sure I wasn't overlooking anything important. And I actually was able to find, or rather my mother, who was helping me look through things, was able to find a piece that, as far as I can tell, no one knew existed before this. It looks like it was her last piece, written sometime in 1966. It's about African decolonization. There are named musical themes named for important people, important countries, both by their colonial and their later names. And it seems to be depicting some sort of story about that process of African nations fighting for independence in the 1960s. One of her later pieces was Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and it's inspired by T.E. Lawrence's book of the same name. She was really fascinated by his story, writing home to her mother about reading his book and just about how wonderful the book was and how important she thought it was. And in the letter, she talks a little bit, she makes reference to Katanga, which was a part of the Congo that seceded during the Civil War that she reported on in 1960. And so when she was there reporting on that, she reported on a lot of war crimes and really horrible violence during that, which kind of gives context to why she was so fascinated with Lawrence's story. Ultimately inspired a work that is probably 10 times as long as most of her other pieces. It's 70 minutes long. There's a prologue, 7 movements, and an epilogue. She uses over 30 named musical themes throughout that represent characters, places, events, quotations, and so on from Lawrence's story. And she also includes some that reflect her own research beyond just reading his book, because several are named for chapters of the Quran and themes related to Islam that seem to be her reflecting on her interpretation of like the meaning behind his story as well. Her music tends to have a lot of dissonance in it, although it really depends on what her inspiration is. Her earlier adult works are arrangements of folk songs, so those vary a lot depending on what country or what region she's drawing inspiration from. But in general, her later works are inspired by Arabic music in particular, and include a lot of dissonance, non-Western scales, tone clusters, and they're very physical to play, so it can be very tiring to perform it, especially a work like 7 Pillars that's 70 minutes long, without a place that's a good spot for an intermission or a break. In researching her music and putting all of this together, it became clear that she had written a lot of important music and that the music combined with her life story was really interesting to people. When I would do performances, a lot of audience members would want to know where they could go to learn more, and there's only one biography of her from 1995. And so that got me thinking about the idea of writing a book about this. Also, there's really not a lot of information out there about her music, since most of it isn't published and very few people have seen the manuscripts at this point. So I really wanted to put out a book that would be accessible to the general public, not just academics, so it's written to be understandable by someone who isn't necessarily a music expert. My album Travelogue features a lot of the music that is discussed in the book, so it can be a good opportunity if you read the book to also hear the music that I'm talking about. And it takes you from Schuyler's earliest adult works, which are folk music arrangements. The first set is inspired by her first trip to Haiti, all the way through to her final work from 1966, that untitled work inspired by African decolonization. And really what I'd like to do with this book and recording is get more people interested. I think her story is fascinating and the music is really unique and can really provide a doorway into learning about a lot of different cultures and history. I certainly learned a lot in the research that I did about everything from, of course, T.E. Lawrence's story to traditional African music, traditional Arabic music, and the history of those regions as well, because she pulls from topics throughout history as well. Mainly, I'd really like someone to walk away from the book, listening to the album, with an interest to learn more about Schuyler, learn more about her music, explore composers that they might not know about already. There's a huge amount of composers and musicians out there that the general public doesn't know about that are really fascinating and have really wonderful music. And so I'd like people to walk away from this with an interest in learning more about that. I started playing piano when I was probably 4. My mom is a piano teacher, so I grew up around music and started very early. I don't really remember learning to play, just always being around piano. I grew up in Indiana, in Evansville. It's in the southern part of the state. I came to South Carolina for the job at Newberry. I've really enjoyed the people I've met here. This book wouldn't have been possible actually without the community here at Newberry. In particular, the press that it's published with was started by one of my colleagues here, Jody Peeler. And so I really would not have been able to do any of this if I hadn't been here at Newberry. So my book, Snapshots of Forgotten Adventures, Rediscovering the Music of Philippa Schuyler, is already available. It is available anywhere that sells books, mostly online, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and other stores, bookshop.org, and it's also available as an ebook through Kindle. And my album Travelogue comes out August 2nd, and it'll be available worldwide everywhere that CDs are sold and everywhere that streams music. So Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon, and everywhere else.